Hello everyone, welcome to our project presentation. Today we're opening our discussion with a very interesting topic, the unending story of reading's development. We usually think that once we learn the alphabet, we can read. But the truth is, reading is a long journey that never really ends. To understand this, let's look at the story of a boy named Luke. Luke was a gifted singer in a children's opera. He could read words correctly, but he had a big problem. He was very slow. Because he couldn't read fast enough, he couldn't keep up with his music. This tells us a very important lesson. Reading correctly is not enough. You also need fluency, which means reading fast enough so your brain can actually understand the meaning. This brings us to a critical change in school. Around fourth grade, when children are about 9 years old, they experience the great shift. Before the fourth grade, children are learning to read. They decode letters and sounds. But from fourth grade on, they must read to learn. They must read automatically to understand science, history, and literature on their own. Sadly, about 40% of fourth graders struggle with this speed. They get lost in a black hole in our education system. But reading is more than just speed. It is about looking below the surface. A fluent reader can understand things like irony and metaphors. Think about books like Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings. These fantasy worlds teach us how to solve problems and predict what will happen next. We call these people strategic readers because they don't just see words. They see a whole new world. Finally, we must remember that books change who we are. When we connect with characters, we expand our own lives. Reading gives us a safe place to explore our feelings and grow. Thank you for listening. Now, let's look at the next parts of our project.
When we become expert readers, reading is not just about looking at letters. It completely changes how we think and feel. This process is connected to our neurobiology. First, the limbic system, which is the emotional center of our brain, becomes very active. Because of this, fluent readers can feel the real emotions. We can feel happy, excited, or even scared while reading a good story. In short, an expert brain doesn't just read words, it deeply feels them. To become fluent, our brain uses two paths, the dorsal and the ventral routes. Beginner readers use the dorsal route. This is a slower path because the brain works hard to analyze every letter and sound. But as we practice, we move to the ventral route. This route is lightning fast. It recognizes words instantly as visual objects. This change gives us the gift of time because decoding becomes automatic. Our brain saves important milliseconds. We use this extra time to think about deeper meanings, understand metaphors, and connect to our own lives. Let's look at what happens inside an expert reader's brain in just half a second. The whole process takes only 500 milliseconds. First, from 0 to 100 milliseconds, it is all about attention. Before we read, the brain must stop looking at other things. It focuses entirely on the text, putting a spotlight on the new letters. Next, between 100 and 200 milliseconds, decoding happens. The brain connects letters to sounds and identifies visual word patterns at a very high speed. And finally, from 200 and 500 milliseconds, we reach the meaning. The brain activates its big network to understand the vocabulary, grammar, and context of the words at the same time. All of this happens before you can blink your eyes. Lastly, let's talk about the mechanism that help this mastery. Reading depends heavily on our memory and our eyes. Our working memory is very important. It acts like a cognitive notepad. It holds the words temporarily while we understand the whole sentence. At the same time, our long-term memory helps us remember our past knowledge. Also, our eye movements are interesting. We feel like our eyes move smoothly across the page, but they do not actually. Instead, they make small, fast jumps and very short stops to collect visual data. With thousands of hours practice, our brain cells connect better. The expert brain creates special networks that work instantly when we look at a page. In conclusion, reading changes the biological structure of our brain. It turns us into critical and independent thinkers.
Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about a process so fast that we take it for granted every single day. When you look at a word on a page, it takes you about 500 milliseconds to understand it. That is literally faster than the blink of an eye. However, in that half second, your brain performs a biological and cultural miracle. Based on the developmental neuroscience found in the book, I want to walk you through the unending story of how an expert brain processes text and how this process ultimately transforms who we are. Let's look at the first 200 milliseconds. This is the recognition phase. Between 0 and 100 milliseconds, your orienting network kicks in. The brain has to disengage from whatever else it was doing and spotlight the letters. As mentioned on the book, this involves the thalamus and the frontal lobes directing your eyes where to go. By 100 to 150 milliseconds, we reach area 37, also known as the visual word from area. This is fascinating because, as neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene argue, these neurons were originally for recognizing objects like snakes or trees. But through literacy, we recycled them to recognize letters. Look at the mirror discrimination example on the slide. Before we learn to read, our brain thinks B and D are the same thing, just like a chair is a chair whether it faces left or right. Alphabetization forces the brain to break this mirror rule, to realize that directions matters. Finally, by 200 milliseconds, we have phonological mapping. This is where the brain connects the visual shape of the letter to its sounds. In expert readers, this happens in the temporal lobe with lighting efficiency. Now, we move into the second half of our journey, synthesis. Between 200 and 500 milliseconds, the brain isn't just looking at shapes, it is digging for gold. It accesses semantics, syntax, and morphology. On the book, we see that if we read a word that doesn't fit the sentence, like the lobster swallowed a mermaid, our brain shows a burst of activity at exactly 400 milliseconds. This is the brain double-checking the meaning. But the most important concept here is the physiological gift of time. Because an expert reader decodes words automatically, the brain saves precious milliseconds. It doesn't have to struggle to sound or out letters. As Marianne Wolf writes, these saved milliseconds are the physiological basis for our capacity to think endless thoughts, most wonderful. We use this extra time to feel, to infer, and to connect the text to our own lives. To wrap up, let's look at the big picture. Literacy physically rewires the brain. On the book, a study of non-literate adults in Portugal showed that their brains processed language differently, mostly in their frontal lobes, as if solving a difficult problem. In contrast, the expert reader's brain has moved this work to highly specialized regions in the left hemisphere. By the time we hit the 500 millisecond mark, the expert reader has fused together vision, sound, meaning, and emotion into a single act of comprehension. We are no longer just decoding information, we are living inside the book. It is, as the test described, the acme of physiologist achievements to understand this remarkable performance. Reading is not just a skill, it is an experience that changes the neural level of our being. Every time we read, we are not the same person we were before we started. Thank you for your time and listening.
Hello everyone. Today we are exploring a biological and cognitive miracle. Reading is not a natural instinct. It's a sophisticated invention. Today we will map how the human brain evolves from basic decoding to expert comprehension. First, we must understand the biological basis. Literacy physically rewires the brain. We aren't just learning a skill, we are creating a new neural architecture that allows us to see, think, and feel through the written word. This development happens in stages. It starts with decoding, the mapping of visual symbols to sounds. But as we mature, we reach deep reading, where we move beyond literal meanings to understand layered metaphors and deep human truths. To read at an expert level, the brain coordinates three massive tasks: executive planning to predict context, working memory to hold complex sentences, and synthesis to connect what we read with everything we already know. This process is a whole brain activity. As the diagram shows, reading is a partnership. The left hemisphere acts as a generator for literal meaning, while the right hemisphere integrates those ideas with our background knowledge and emotion. Ultimately, as Marine Wolf wrote, the story of reading is unending. Every book we finish leaves us slightly different from who we were before. I'd love to hear your thoughts or answer any questions you may have. Thank you for your listening.